In the quiet suburbs of Wichita, Kansas, families built their lives believing they were safe, a place where neighbors waved across trimmed lawns and locks were often left undone. But beneath the surface, something cold was waiting. For more than 3 decades, a predator walked among them, a husband, a father, a church leader, a city inspector, a phantom hiding in plain sight. He called himself BTK, bind, torture, kill. Tonight, we open the files sealed in dread, the words spoken by the killer himself, and the secrets that lay buried under his mask of normalcy. Welcome to Shadow Tales. January 15th, 1974. A morning like any other in a quiet Wichita neighborhood. Frost clung to rooftops, and the faint breath of winter drifted through tree branches. Inside the Otero home, the family prepared for their day, children grabbing backpacks, parents boiling coffee, the rhythm of small domestic routines that define ordinary life. But outside, watching from the cold, stood a man who had already chosen them, a man who had stalked, measured, planned. To him, they were not a family. They were a project. Dennis Rader later described this moment with a disturbing casualness, as though his decision were nothing more than selecting a task from a list. He had studied the house, learned the patterns. He believed control was already his before he ever stepped inside. But what unfolded behind those walls would mark one of the darkest moments in Wichita's history. When Rader entered, everything changed. The walls of that home absorbed terror they had never known. The Oteros fought, pleaded, struggled to survive. Yet Rader operated with an unsettling calm, repeating the steps he'd rehearsed in fantasy for years. He bound them, one by one. His voice remained steady as he reassured them he only wanted money, that he wouldn't hurt them. But his lies were as tightly wound as the knots tied. What investigators found later defied understanding. A slaughter that seemed fueled not by rage but by ritual. Crime scene photos revealed precision, binding techniques, positioning, staging. This was no impulsive attack. It was a performance of control, one the killer had been writing long before the victims ever realized they were part of his story. The city absorbed the shock like a blow to the chest. The Otero murders sent a tremor through Wichita, a place many believed immune to true evil. Parents locked their doors for the first time. Children were walked to school instead of sent alone. Yet what terrified the community most was not what law enforcement found, but what they didn't. There were no solid leads, no motive, no connection tying suspect to victims. And somewhere, watching the panic unfold on nightly news, sat Dennis Rader, eating dinner with his family, listening to weather reports, pretending to be another concerned citizen. In his mind, the chapter was complete. He had tested his abilities and proven to himself that he could control life and death like switches on a wall. But the monster who murdered the Otero family wasn't finished. He had tasted the power of fear. Now he wanted the world to know his name. As years passed without another attack, Wichita began to cautiously breathe again. But in the mind of the murderer, silence was not peace, it was patience. Dennis Rader had retreated into the shadows, studying the reactions to his work. The confusion, the fear, the unanswered questions that echoed through the city. And eventually, that wasn't enough. He wanted recognition. He wanted the world to see his crimes not as chaos, but as art. Then the letters began. The first communications were cryptic, almost mocking. Sent to media outlets, they contained intimate details of the Otero murders, information known only to the killer and investigators. The tone was strange, detached, as if he were submitting a resume rather than confessing to murder. He referred to himself using the acronym BTK, which he coined to define his methodology: bind, torture, kill. The callous pride embedded in those words chilled even the most seasoned detectives. BTK's letters revealed a psyche fractured yet deliberate. His grammar and spelling were inconsistent. His references oddly intellectual one moment and childlike the next. He switched personas rapidly, sometimes boasting of his prowess as a hunter, sometimes posing as a misunderstood artist seeking an audience. He peppered his letters with taunts, riddles, and demands for attention. And the public listened. Newspapers printed the letters, reporters dissected them. Law enforcement, reluctantly, acknowledged the killer's existence. This was exactly what BTK wanted, a stage. But the letters did more than put BTK in the spotlight. They exposed his obsession with control. He meticulously explained his fantasies, listed potential victims, and even provided sketches. Each note served as both a confession and a performance. He wanted to be feared, but more importantly, he wanted to be studied. To him, notoriety was a form of immortality. Investigators attempted to read between the lines for clues about his identity. They analyzed his speech patterns, handwritings, references to emotions he didn't truly feel. They began to see a pattern. BTK craved validation the way other people crave companionship. When the city talked about him, he felt alive. But just as he emerged, he vanished again. The letters stopped. Years rolled into decades, and BTK disappeared from public consciousness. For most killers, such long silence would be unusual, but for Rader, it was part of the game. He laid low, tended to his family, gained positions of authority within his church, and built a life so ordinary that the idea of him as a serial killer seemed laughable. But deep inside the void of his double life, BTK waited for the world to forget, so he could delight them with a return they never expected. And eventually, he did. To the outside world, Dennis Rader embodied the definition of normalcy. He worked steady jobs, served his church faithfully, and raised 2 children who adored him. He coached scouts. He enforced city codes with meticulous attention to detail. Neighbors remembered him as polite, even helpful, the kind of man who would lend tools or chat casually over backyard fences. This was not a disguise he wore occasionally. It was a life he crafted deliberately, a role he performed with the same devotion he applied to his crimes. In many ways, Rader's family life was the ultimate camouflage. But behind closed doors, cracks formed in the façade. Rader maintained strict routines, rigid expectations, and an emotional distance that many interpreted as mere sternness. But that coldness masked a far darker truth. Every day he fought an internal battle between his constructed identity and the urges he believed defined him. Rader kept private journals detailing his fantasies and past crimes. He drew diagrams of bindings, sketched potential victims, and wrote scripts of encounters he hoped to stage someday. These notebooks were hidden carefully, buried within his home like toxic artifacts. Even his wife, whom he married before the murders began, had no idea the man she shared a bed with lived a second life in his mind. Friends described him as a perfectionist, but perfection for Rader meant something sinister: order, obedience, and absolute control. Whether writing parking tickets or planning a murder, he approached tasks with methodical precision. Every aspect of his life operated in compartments, each sealed off from the others. The most disturbing part was how genuinely he played the role of a family man. He seemed to believe he could maintain both identities indefinitely, as though his crimes existed in a separate dimension that would never bleed into his carefully curated domestic life. He attended church the morning after certain killings. He disciplined his children the same week he stalked future victims. Investigators later described his double life as psychologically chilling because Rader didn't consider his roles contradictory. He wasn't torn between good and evil. He saw both as essential components of who he was: a husband, a father, a president of the church council, and a predator whose appetite for control only grew with time. The people of Wichita never suspected him. How could they? Evil rarely enters a neighborhood wearing a monster's grin. More often, it arrives wearing a pressed shirt, waving hello, hiding its darkness behind the kind of smile you never think to fear. Rader's greatest triumph wasn't a single crime. It was how perfectly he hid in plain sight. By 2004, more than 25 years had passed since BTK's last known communication. Wichita believed the killer was either dead or imprisoned on unrelated charges. The case had grown cold, its files collecting dust. But Rader was restless. He watched anniversaries of the Otero murders appear on television, saw documentaries speculate about the killer's identity, and inside him, the desire for attention rekindled. He began sending messages again, packages left in remote locations, photographs, a doll bound with ropes. These macabre tokens reignited fear and renewed law enforcement's focus. But Rader felt untouchable. Decades of evasion had convinced him he was smarter than investigators. Then, in an extraordinary display of arrogance, he asked the police a question. Can a floppy disk be traced back to me? Investigators, aware that this could be their breakthrough, crafted the perfect lie. No, it's safe. Rader took the bait. When the floppy disk arrived at KSAS-TV, analysts rushed to examine it. They discovered deleted data fragments, metadata containing the name of a user, Dennis, organization, Christ Lutheran Church. The document had been last modified on a computer registered to Dennis Rader, a church council president and a compliance officer for the city. Nearly 30 years of mystery began to unravel in seconds. Detectives launched quiet surveillance on Rader. They noted his routine, his vehicles, his habits, yet they still needed definitive DNA evidence. Investigators acquired a biological sample indirectly from Rader's daughter's medical records, legally accessed with a court order. The results were conclusive. BTK had a name, a face, a life built on lies. Rader was pulled over on February 25, 2005, in a quiet suburban street. When officers approached, he surrendered calmly, almost gracefully, as though he had been waiting for this moment. Inside his home and office, investigators found journals, sketches, trophies, and meticulous records of his crimes. The double life collapsed in a single day. The floppy disk, an outdated piece of technology, had become the noose he placed around his own neck. His downfall was not the product of detective brilliance alone, but of his own insatiable need for recognition. He needed to be seen, and that need sealed his fate. Even years later, detectives marveled at the irony. A serial killer who outsmarted police for decades was finally undone by metadata, by the digital fingerprints he never thought to hide. In the interrogation room, investigators expected defiance or hostility. Instead, they encountered something far more unsettling: cooperation. Dennis Rader entered with an air of calm professionalism, as though attending a routine meeting rather than facing charges for 10 murders. He sat comfortably, hands folded, answering questions with practiced clarity. When detectives asked if he understood why he was being arrested, Rader responded almost cheerfully, "Oh, I have suspicions." Then, without hesitation, he began recounting his crimes, not emotionally, not regretfully, but methodically, describing each murder as though reading a technical manual. He detailed how he stalked victims, how he chose them, how he bound them. He narrated his actions with chilling composure, occasionally pausing to correct small inaccuracies, ensuring the record reflected his version of events. To Rader, confession was not surrender, it was storytelling. Investigators listened, horrified, as he reminisced about each crime with the tone of a man describing old hobbies. He spoke about the moment he realized he enjoyed binding people, the thrill of control, the fantasies he nurtured. He explained his rituals, his preparations, even the missteps that frustrated him. His descriptions were not gruesome for the sake of shock. They were clinical. This made them infinitely worse. It revealed that he saw his victims not as human beings, but as characters in a narrative he authored. At times he smiled. At times he reminisced. At times he seemed proud. One detective later said that listening to Rader felt like watching a man assemble furniture, cold, procedural, devoid of empathy. He corrected officers when they mispronounced details or misstated sequences. Accuracy mattered to him, not because of justice, but because he wanted the story told correctly. Throughout the interview, Rader frequently slipped into third person, creating distance between himself and BTK. It was as though he believed he could separate the killer from the man, two roles he had mastered, now colliding in front of a captive audience. And yet, beneath the narrative control, investigators sensed something else: relief. Rader had spent decades hiding. The weight of secrecy had exhausted him. Confession provided him with a stage, a return to relevance, and a final act of control. But now, the story was no longer his to write. The curtain had fallen. The mask was off. The world finally knew who BTK truly was. Kansas is quiet again. The houses are warm. The lawns are trimmed. Life continues. But the shadow Dennis Rader cast still lingers, a reminder of the darkness that can thrive behind the most ordinary doors. In his words, investigators found closure. In his capture, the city found peace. But in his legacy, we are left with a haunting lesson. Evil doesn't always wear a monster's face. Sometimes, It wears a neighbor's smile. You are watching Shadow Tales. Stay watchful, stay curious, and remember, even the darkest secrets eventually crawl into the light.